projekci už jste měli možnost vidět dnes po poledni. Další projekce budou následovat.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me welcome you to Chiara Magri's lecture. Chiara Magri is an Italian film historian focusing on animated films. She works at Centro Sperimentale di Cinematografia, which is a film school, and she's based in a Torino branch of this film school, and she works as a coordinator at the Institute for Animation. Her lecture is part of the Italian section series. You have had the opportunity to see one screening this afternoon. There are more screenings of the so-called Italian Neo-pictorial Animation.
Tak a předáváme už tedy slovo Chiaře Magri. Pokud tedy potřebujete překlad z angličtiny do českého jazyka, tak využijte překlad ve sluchátkách.
Now I'm giving over to Chiara Magri. If you need interpretation from English into Czech, please use the headphones.
Thank you so much. Yes, I work for one of the two animation schools in Italy. Our school started in 2002, while the other one is the School of Book in Urbino, in the Marche region, which is mainly, they started in the 50s, and actually this movement, so-called pictorialism of Italian animation, comes much from that school. My English is not enough. I'm not feeling so safe, so I will be boring, and I will read my paper. I'll try at least to manage. At least 10 years ago, Bendazzi, he is an historian of animation actually. I'm not really. And he, at least 10 years ago, he named this wave of animators we see in Italy since the 90s, neo-pictorials. And the phenomenon has begun at the end of the 80s, actually. And so I'll tell you about that a little bit on the basis of the programs that were selected by the festival, but with little digression. And I won't talk about all these authors. There are so many, and they are evolving. And also there is Magda Guidi here with us, and we will hear about her work from her words. When is your screening? Quando è la tua? 8. Okay. So I left. And in fact, this wave consists of very different works and authors, but they actually have a few elements in common, but I think, very essential elements. The first one is that they all present an urge for expression. You feel that these are personal films that were made because their authors wanted to make their films. And the simple reason, because we are sure of that, is that all those films, at least at their beginnings, were self-produced. Like many animation authors, they self-produced themselves, not just in Italy, of course. And self-production gives this feeling of, I do because I need to do it, which is not, which is important, I think. They share the practice of animation as a flexible medium for personal artistic expression, of course. Their use of the pro-filmic, pro-filmic, I mean what is put in front of the camera, is something that make the pro-filmic always recognizable, always, it's always clear that it is already a product of art, it is already an artifact, which is, of course, the issue of animation, generally speaking. But in this films, you can really touch the material of which the film is made. You can feel that an artist already made the filmic. Also, in many cases, this author seems to give a high value of the process, not in a meta-filmic way. I mean, not always in a meta. They don't actually want to make meta-films, about films about filming, but the process is shown as an important part of the role of the artist. Not everyone, but most of them, Simone Massi first of all, I think, they want to show how big effort is to make their animation, and this gives a value. They give value to the process, to the art craftsmanship of their work. I mean, they practice animation as a high craftsmanship labor and the pursuit of some technical perfection. You can feel that, and also. Of course, most of them have a very strong relationship with illustration and the tradition of Italian classical painting, not by chance in Urbino, which is a region where the cult of paintings, maybe the deeper root of Italian classical painting is in the Mark. Raffaello is from there, by the way. And I have the feeling that they all show that they feel constantly confronted with the idea of classical beauty. Maybe even in those authors which deal with ugliness, like maybe Donato Sansone or Toccafondo or Marco Cappellacci. I think they always feel in front of the ideal beauty, anyway, which is, again, I think, a very Italian thing, to be, well, in relationship with the classical idea of beauty, of balance, of perspective, of all these things. So the retrospective you see in Anifilm reflects the fact that the majority of these artists comes from the Urbino school of book, as they call it, which was actually a high school, and which is very important to understand. Is quite rare, the fact that in high school you practice animation, maybe not much in the old times, but at least the idea, a lot of the idea of testing your drawing, testing your illustration in movement. And this is on the technical side. But what I think very important is the role of the teachers like Roberto Catani, who is a teacher, and from him a lot of these new authors came. That wants the animation to be a way for personal development of the kids, because they start as kids, is not aimed to a technical, professional training, but is aimed to develop personalities, even if they won't go on with animation in their profession, which makes, I think, another reason for this strong personal impact of those films. So the school actually nurtured much of the new wave that Bendazzi defines as neo-pictorialism, but there are others like Ursula Ferrara and Donato Sansone with different backgrounds and education, or no films and no animation education at all, like in the case of Ursula Ferrara. And now I hope I can tell you about another school, which is our school, which is very different from Urbino, that, by the way, now has got a 2-year specialization course, of course, a professional course after the high school. But our school is very different. I'll tell you about our school on Friday while presenting our students' program. Anyway, it's very different, but still I hope and I see that from our school other young filmmakers are emerging in the international panorama, like, of course, Donato Sansone, but also Martina Scarpelli. I think she can be included in the new wave. I'll show you later one of her diploma film. And Francesco Vecchi, who is not very well known, but is very interesting, crazy filmmaker while working in the industry of animation in Paris. Or Massimo Ottoni, which is homonymous to the Massimo Ottoni who studied in Urbino, but with a very different approach. He's a stop-motion animator. So the artists we are talking about were all born between 61 and 82 of the last century, of course. And so I think they all share a common background. They all must have been influenced by the Italian cultural environment of the 80s and the early 90s. So I can give you some information about this environment. In the 80s, Italian animation was the time of the big crisis. In fact, but they say that crisis means also opportunities, and I think that at least in this case, it demonstrates it's true. But going backward, in the contemporary art field, which I think is anyway very influencing also on animation, and I'll show you quickly what was going on in contemporary art, if I got the file. Yes. Oh, I can't see the, here we are. Oops. Is there a doc? This is a doc.
Okay.
A Word file. It doesn't matter. Sorry. I'll show you. Anyway, that was the end of the conceptual and arte povera, and was the affirmation of a movement called Transavanguardia. This was Enzo Cucchi, Mimmo Palladino, Nicola De Maria. I can show you later, I hope, some of these authors. And they all expressed the need and will to go back to the joy of painting. And this is not by chance that afterwards, and this spread into illustration, and I think spread into animation as well. So the idea was to make art again with the artist's hands and not just with the artist's brain, like in conceptual art. Going back to the joy of color, to the joy of figuration. And Enzo Cucchi, by the way, which is one of the most known Transavanguardia artists, is from Marke as well. And his work is inspired as well by the Marke landscape and figures, I think. Anyway, and that's just to have an idea, but we'll see the images afterwards, I hope. As for the animation, the crisis came mainly because the old format for advertising in television changed very abruptly, very suddenly at the end of the 70s. And the many small animation studios that used to create mini-series, real mini-series in black and white, but then also in colors, as advertising film. For instance, The Line by Cavandoli, which you may know was born and was used for advertising, they just stopped producing because advertising changed a lot. They started live action most of all. So. And also crisis because the Italian television channels used to broadcast just American and Japanese animated series. So there was no interest in Italian projects. Actually, in the 60s and 70s, especially in Milan, small and medium animation studios had flourished, working mainly for advertising, but sometimes for larger projects like the feature films by Bruno Bozzetto, VIP, Western Soda and Allegro Non Troppo, which is quite well known, I think, were made in the 70s. And also there were some little, not so small project like medium length feature that all this brought to Milan very many different artists from different areas to cooperate on these feature films, and illustrators, graphic designers, scenographers, not just cartoonists. And this created an interest in animation and in its possibilities very different from what we were used to, not just cartoon, not just like derivation from comic books, but something that could be more arty, at least. There were many people working at those times in Milan with this in mind, and also there were studios big enough to attract artists from abroad. We had Oscar Grigio in Italy working for advertising. We had Tomislav Spikic so the terrain was fertile for animation, but all based on the ground of advertising. So when it stopped, the crisis was that no more work for anyone. Also Bruno Bozzetto, that I think you know his style, his poetic, was experimenting with his team, with other artists. And I want to show you a film called Ego, which is a film, experimental film, which is quite rare in the Bruno Bozzetto production, where a person called Giovanni Mulazzani cooperate, and I want to show you the sequence of this short film.
You can use your own computer.
Mine?
Yeah.
Oh.
It's connected.
So I can show you just to have an idea. Well, this is what conceptual art was. This is the famous Merde d'artiste by Piero Manzoni, no? Very conceptual, but not inspiring for animators, maybe. And this is Pino Pascali, The Trap, which is more arte povera. You see, this is from the 60s, actually. By the way, Pino Pascali made also animation commercials, but with a fake name. Really cartoonish. And this is Transavanguardia. You see Enzo Cucchi, I was talking before, from Marche. The joy of painting. This is painting, and this is drawing. I think that Urbino School has seen these things. What do you think? Magda, you agree? Of course, yeah. This is very much Roberto Catani inspired by, yes. And the film I wanted to show is here. Hopefully. Bad quality is just it's just to have a little idea of the researches that were made during the 60s and the 70s in Milan, not just cartoon for TV, but also, and this is Mulazzani work. The idea of ego is to investigate into the mind of the ordinary man, his dreams, his obsession, his preconception, his forbidden dreams, as you will see. Between dreams and reality, of course. And there were Studio Orti as well, Giulio Cingoli, who is a filmmaker, very interested in also in new technologies. He worked a lot for the image of the third channel of Italian public broadcaster, which is Rai 3, which was created for culture and innovation, and he gave much to this new image of through animation, experimental way of moving in electronic, of course, at those times, and he is from Urbino as well. So, and Giovanni Murazzani, this man, then later founded a studio called Mix Film, is actually this Mix Film is actually the first producer of Gianluigi Toccafondo's film. So there's a continuous line between those people. The problem, as usual, was mainly money, not the spirit that laid behind these people. The idea of animation as a way of expression was there, of course. And in Rome as well, there was a company called Corona Cinematografica. They were very important. They used to produce all the newsreel for cinemas and lots of documentaries, and also with the support of the state, animation short films. They co-produced or at least distributed the films of Zagreb Film. So again, there were a bridge, there were a connection between the Italian animation environment and the animation world, which was not orthodox, was not Disney, was something different, of course. Corona Cinematografica, this company, had relationship with many Eastern European countries that of course had a completely different vision of what animation can do, what can be achieved with animation. And in Rome, with Corona Cinematografica, a very important filmmaker, first of all a painter who became filmmaker, was produced by Corona. His name is Manfredo Manfredi. He's now back to painting since a long time, but those times he made many short films. The most successful and maybe the most interesting of his first films was called Dedalo. It was a very personal film where you could actually feel the drawing, a very personal style, a very non-linear narration. And this film was successful, was made in the 70s. I don't really remember, it was 76, I think. It won a prize at Ottawa. It was nominated for an Oscar. So it was very influencing on the next generation of animator in Italy. And apart from the very personal style of his drawing, and apart from the manipulation of rotoscoped material, which was very innovative, the most surprising, fascinating aspect of the film was that the camera moves were simulated mainly by the drawings and were not made by the camera itself, which is normal today, but wasn't at those times. Much later, in 1998, the public broadcaster Rai supported the production of one of his of Manfredi's short film within a project that now is over, within which the public television actually seemed to be interested in producing short animation films. There were a short time where Rai actually produced not much, but tried to experiment in animation intended for an adult audience, intended not just like series for children, like is it now in Italy, actually, in television. And produced these films by Manfredi, which is based on The Invisible Cities, which is a novel by Italo Calvino, one of the most important Italian writers. I'll show you. Invisible Cities, can you see? Yeah. Try, but it's Marco Polo who is listening to this description of imaginary cities. Each one has a specific characteristic, and the story is told by the king of Mongolia to Marco Polo. It's in Italian, but actually the images shows what the story tells. Actually, you can't hear. Thank you. Sorry. Sorry for the sound, but anyway, you could feel how underrated was the voiceover. No, it's just a voiceover reading the text by Calvino. And this is not because of Manfredi, I think it's more because the production was TV production. They, on one side it was good, of course, because they had money to produce, but not enough for working on sound as much as you need to, and as it now, actually, when you can, especially when there are sound designers specialized in animation who actually helped a lot this new wave, like, of course, Andrea Martignoni and Mario Mariani and Sasso. I won't talk about this side, but sound has got a very important role in this neo-pictorialism wave animation. It's strange to say, but actually sound and painting are the same thing sometimes in those films. Anyway, in the 70s, 80s, Manfredi, in the 90s at least, produced this film that was influential as well, as you can see, both because of the hand-drawn and of the new technologies, the use of rotoscope, which is very interesting. There are things that reminds me of Toccafondo in this film. And there was also a couple working together, which is Emanuele Luzzati and Giulio Giannini, who were working, well, Luzzati was a very, very important, very, very well-known scenographer, illustrator, costume designer, and what's more, he made ceramics as well. And Giulio Giannini in Rome, he was based, Luzzati in Genoa, and Giulio Giannini based in Rome, he was a cinematographer, a director of photography, I don't know how do you say, and he made many documentaries. And then when he met with Luzzati, they decided to make short films together, and they produced at least, I think, two of the most well-known Italian short films, which are called The Thieving Magpie, La Gazza Ladra, and Pulcinella, Punch, based on the music by Rossini. And also they made together a feature film with an Austrian production on the Magic Flute by Mozart. So they were inspired by music. And I can show you, again, very bad quality, just a little bit of Magic Flute, just to see the style, the drawings by Luzzati. And they actually used cuts out because the graphic of Luzzati, which is so personal, so strong, if you can see, of course couldn't be animated in traditional way, so they decided to use cuts out. But the animation by Giannini is so smooth, it's so clever, that it works like it was drawing, I think so. And this is the Magic Flute. So this was in Rome. Giulio Giannini in Rome started the animation course at Centro Sperimentale, the National Film School, that actually had a course in Rome, but it closed down at the end of the 90s. It was very different from our school now because there were no job in animation at all, so it was fair to have a course with Giannini in Rome for a very little number of students. There were 4, 6 students who studied there, and the idea was to allow them to make their films, to make personal films, and not to train people and artists and technicians for the industry, so-called industry, that is our main aim now at CSC. But this also gave a seed, put a seed, very important seed also in Rome to young generation to use animation as a personal expression medium, to be very open-minded about what animation can be. And also in Bologna, the atmosphere was very fertile, were very, very interesting, especially for comic books, for illustrators. There were new magazines like Frigidaire, maybe not, but anyway, who were the first experience for people like Lorenzo Mattotti, the famous illustrator. He designed the Pinocchio film by Enzo Dalò, for instance, not long ago, I think 2 or 3 years ago. And there were people like Stefano Ricci as well, who started those time in Bologna, and University of Bologna and the Academy of Fine Arts were very interesting places where people from all over Italy wanted to go and study, because it was the first place where art, theater, music, and cinema were treated as a whole thing, no? In a multidisciplinary way. And Blue, the street artist, you may know, that is part of the retrospective as well, was influenced by this Bologna atmosphere, cultural and alternative atmosphere. Also in Torino, we had in the 80s, in Torino started the Italian branch of ASIFA. You know, ASIFA still is, though it changed much, but it was very, very, very strong international association of animators. And we opened the Italian branch just in Torino, where we had again, at university, a professor called Gianni Rondolino, who was, I think, the first to look at animation as a cinema and not just as a trash or, you know, because that was the concept of animation in Italy in the 80s. Also because what was on TV was actually very bad usually, because they used to broadcast Japanese animation of bad quality, edited in awful ways, dubbed in awful ways. So actually the idea of animation was millions of miles away from what we now know. So the terrain was very fertile, and but the crisis stopped almost every production. Sorry, I have to pay my papers. I was talking about ASIFA in Torino. Well, I worked for ASIFA a lot, and we organized a festival, which is important. It was the only one festival in Italy about animation. It wasn't in Torino. We organized from Torino in Treviso, which is near Venice. And that was, again, a very good opportunity, I think, for young people to see films from abroad, short films, and so on. And in 1989, at ASIFA Italia, we got application of one film called La Coda by Gianluigi Toccafondo, a young artist. And then in 91, we got La Pista from him. And another little film called Amore Asimmetrico, Asymmetrical Love, by Ursula Ferrara. And then in 95 we got Come Persone by Ursula Ferrara again, and a very tiny little film called Goldfish by Roberto Catania. We were actually very surprised, especially La Coda by Toccafondo really blew our minds, because it says something had really changed in the animation Italian environment. And actually a big change in animation short films seemed to have started in the early 90s, I think a bit everywhere. There were a shift from themes and stories of universal concern, like metaphorical films, apologues, etc., like those of Bruno Bozzetto were, a shift to personal tales of subjective, even intimate experiences. And also the idea of how the artist can use animation became much more open in terms of genre, in terms of style, in terms, of course, of content. And I guess that this was an international trend we could witness and we could feel at Festival of Short Animation. And with the appearance of Toccafondo, everyone in Italian animation community found out at last there was the School of Book in Urbino, where education was developed also through the practice of animation drawings. And, well, again, the Marche is one of the Italian region with a true cult for painting and a great tradition in illustration and handcrafted artistic publishing. I found some of the works by Enrico Ricci, who was a teacher there, and Toccafondo recalls him very fondly. Though I think I found a painting of him that I think is more influential on Catani maybe than Toccafondo. It's here. Cucchi. Oh yes, I forgot to show you this. Francesco Clemente, another Transavanguardia artist. I think this self-portrait is very close to Donato Sansone, more than others. Anyway, this is Lorenzo Mattotti. Oh, I've lost the image of, oh no, here it is. And this is one of the teachers at Urbino School, Enrico Ricci. You see how close I think he is to another important art movement, Italian art movement, who developed much earlier, which is metaphysical painting, that influenced a lot, I think, the imagery of the teachers, of Roberto Catani, which is a derivation as well, in a way, of classical art painting. This is De Chirico, you know. The perspective is so important in this kind of painting, and is so important, I think, in Roberto Catani's work. Yes, of course, his metamorphosis is always also a research on perspective that I think we can find in his films. And a metaphysical painter can be more or less considered also Giorgio Morandi, can you see? And this again interested a lot Simone Massi when he was looking for his trait, his sign, his way of engraving his films. Simone Massi looked a lot to Morandi's engravings and drawings. The crossed line you see in Morandi are very influential on Simone Massi, but and so this environment, this presence of the classical and painters, so strong influence on Urbino. You see metaphysical is Carlo Carrà. This one is even more explicit influence, I think. Roberto Catani's first film, Goldfish, we saw, was very promising, looked like unpretentious illustration of a dream, told by a soft voiceover, but actually created a vast pictorial space in which figures and objects moved around across the frame, carrying a dreamy narrative by fluid movements of metamorphoses of shapes and simulated camera moves rather than through film cuts. And so the result was really the feeling of an audiovisual poetry in motion. And there was amazing the work of Ursula Ferrara. She said, "Of course, in my movies, the technique counts a lot. I'm not traditional at all costs. Personally, I have to feel the brush in hand, the pencil, the smells, and the physicality of the painting as an extension of the brain. According to the length of the short film, I do everything myself. I'm more of the idea that those who make shorts should do just about everything. Direction, photography, editing," and she doesn't even mention painting, by the way. "I do not think about the potential audience. My first potential spectator is my family, my husband." And she says as well, "Besides, I've worked for 10 years alone, like the Japanese soldier who is on a desert island and do not know that the war is over." So what those three animators, Catani, Toccafondo, and Ferrara had in common? Oh, again, self-evident was that the main reason for the work was the urge for expression. They were all self-produced, at least at their beginnings, since later on, after their first film weren't successful at festivals, some of them got support from external sources like Arte, La Septe, or Sensei, or even French private companies like Simone Massi got money from France. Ursula Ferrara as well got some funding from France, and Gianluigi Toccafondo had funding from France. It seems still now that France is the only place where short animation film can be funded. Anyway, Toccafondo was produced by an Italian production company, live action film company called Fandango afterwards anyway. But I think he's the only one who managed to get money from Italy for his films. Anyway, self-production for them and for almost all of these new pictorial artists means that most of them work not just on their personal films, not just in animation, but they also work as illustrators, designers, image creators for multimedia arts like theater, music, for communication, for advertising, etc. Some, like Toccafondo, conceive some projects as the production of both still images and moving images, that is animation films. Can be illustrated books like those of Stefano Ricci, or can be yes, like Toccafondo, he sells his paintings or the so-called original images of his films, but I think he's the only one now, still now, who is accepted in the art with the big A environment. He's the only artist that can show at art fairs and art galleries, while the others are more in graphic design or illustration dealers, galleries, and fairs. Also, those three animators showed us that the idea of animation author was evolving. Their authorship, in fact, was expressed not just by the content of the film, by its statement, by its message, but was something very different from what we were used to see, like in a Bozzetto film, where drawings is taken just as a tool. Often Bruno Bozzetto had relied on other artists' hands and styles, and also when he approached new tools like the digital software Flash. He was one of the first animation authors to be fond of Flash because easy because cheap. Well, when he started making films with flash, he completely gave up the idea of style. No, he started making films with the characters were just triangles, little squares, or. But now with those neo-pictorials, the idea of authorship was very different. The idea of personal style. Again, they wanted to show the pro-filmic material. They wanted to show that was handmade or was anyway art-made, was the precise style and sign of an artist who was talking. And often they make it even more clear by unveiling the trick, showing and declaring somehow also the animation process that makes the film, like in Toccafondo, visible frame counter on the screen, or in Catani and Ursula Ferrara, very slow-paced animation with lots of still frames and poses. I think they were made on purpose, or we don't know, at the beginning maybe errors, in a way, mistakes, but anyway, they let the viewers see the process of animating paintings. And here I want just to recall a British scholar who wrote, I think was one of the first to research on animation on a theoretical side many years ago, in the 90s as well. He started investigating animation, and one of his books is called Genre and Authorship in Animation Film, and actually he divides in categories the animation author, like supra author like Disney, who phagocytates all the different author artists who work on the film in just one brand. He talks about infra authors like, let's say, master of special effects like Ray Harryhausen, and he talks about the third category, which is the experimental author that uses animation as individual tool of expression. But what is interesting in Paul Wells is that all that means that animation can be either the least and the most authorist of all film practices. And we can easily define all these Italian neo-pictorial animators as experimental, with the most intimate approach to filmmaking. And Wells also suggests that animation film can put into categories, just as a tool, of course, for researching on it. And he divides into formal, deconstructive, political, paradigmatic, and abstract. A re-narration, which is like The Invisible City was a re-narration of a tale, no? And paradigmatic and primal. And Primal for Wells is a film that depicts, defines, and explores specific emotions, feelings, or state of consciousness. And of course, all the categories are not univoc, but can be useful for a better understanding of the poetics of those authors, to think about which category, or rather categories, these films belong to, and see how their authors moved during their careers from one to another, or rather intersected these categories without losing their identity, their voice. Ferrara, Ursula Ferrara, for instance, is primal. She depicts her family life, but later with a film called News, which is in the program, I think. She creates sort of a protest film. She conveys the issue of that is behind the sensationalized newspaper headlines about the atrocities and the injustice of the world. And Toccafondo usually re-narrates and interprets others' text, like the icons of cinema in La Pista or Le Criminel, or even in the his latest film, which is Thugs Without Legend, or from literature. He told the story of Pinocchio again, and also he made films inspired by Pasolini text. But with the Little Russia, which is in the program, he gives a very personal account of his homeland and family memories. What I want to suggest is that regardless of the subjects, themes, or let's say categories, it is the way the events in these films are presented to the viewer that contributes much to their identity, to the identity of their work. I mean, the way they use or reinvent film language. Furthermore, we know that even the more conventional kind of animation film have a particular ways for presenting their narrative. Perhaps because, and I'm quoting again a scholar, which is Susanne Buchan, and she says perhaps the peculiar way is because regardless of the technique used, animation has long been liberated from the mundane constraints of ordinary space and time, from realism and from depiction of the natural world. So what I think would be interesting to search, to look at, is the viewpoint of these films. I mean, viewpoint is where you put the camera, your imaginary camera, is not the POV, not the point of view, which is the subjective shot. I think that the viewpoint determines one, not just me, determines one of the most important elements of the narrative and one of the most important elements of those films. We already know that in those films, the viewer has no doubt that they are the expression of an individual. They are the expression of an author who created the image and perhaps the sound as well. The creator, who gives you his vision of reality or his vision of his thoughts, exactly like a painter does. We immediately hear the voice of the author, of the artist. But given this awareness, the relationship between the author and the spectator can be nevertheless established in very different ways. And those films do establish the relationship with the author in different ways. There are authors of animation shorts that tell a story taking place in a world that needs to be credible. And usually these are the most narrative films. I think, for example, of films like Father and Daughter by Ludovic de Witt, which is very arty, is very painting, but still is very concrete. It takes place in an imaginary where you must believe in his word. Or, if I'm allowed to say the big name here, even in films like Dimensions of Dialogue, they present another reality, but Schwankmajer forces us to believe in this world and to be emotionally involved in this world. And in those films, the author becomes the invisible observer. You don't feel the viewpoint of the author. It's hidden. Or there are films like those of Simone Massi, in which the author addresses the viewer very directly, I think. Often in this group of films, there are very subjective treatment through implicit POV shots and what I could name false objective shots. Implicit POV, I mean that we spectators don't see from the viewpoint of a specific character like in explicit POV, but still we get the impression to watch the film straight for the author's eye and mind, that he is here with us behind the camera. And this happens, I think, mainly when the film structure is based on sequence tracking shots, uncut scenes, long tracking shots. And that's very true in Simone Massi film. And, or in films like Come Persone by Ursula Ferrara. that leads the viewer along an uncut tracking shot to discover what she sees and what she draws. What time is it? 10 minutes. So what I want to suggest is to go beyond the surface, very interesting surface of the image, of its metamorphosis, and try to look at the film language this author used, because all of them, they are not abstract. Anyway, there's a film language in every film, of course, but they have very different ways of expressing, not just because of their sign, because of their drawing, because of their paintings, but they've got very different ways of using the camera, of using film language, even though in the Urbino school there's a tendency of sequence shot, and I think that the consequences of this school could be that if they go on studying cinema and finding their own way of, and their own point of view, their own regard, it can become something bigger and bigger and bigger. Because sometimes in Italy now there's someone that says, okay, they do all the same, no? Because of tracking shot, because Simone Massi and Julia Romskaya, you'll see, they use more or less the same way of traveling around the world with the camera. But actually they have very different approaches, so that's very important. And if we got just 5 minutes, I want to show you, I'm sorry because I talk too much of the past and not of the present. And talking of the present, I want to show you two films you won't see in the retrospective. One is Donato Sansone, who is, relationship with the spectator he does. If you look closely to his films, both of them, especially Topo Glassato, Frosted Chocolate Mouse, you see it's just drawing, but the camera is always jerky, it's shaking, it doesn't stay still. It's like a mistaken camera that shows the audience that someone is filming the drawing, for instance. A bit like in Blue films like Muto, is not a simulated world, is not an illusion of life taking places on the walls, is not an illusion of the drawing really moving on the walls, because there's the camera who's shooting, and you feel the camera is shooting someone invisible because he is pixelated, someone who is drawing on the wall, and that makes a very straight contact with the audience. It's, again, an author talking, I'm doing that, and you are seeing that. Anyway, I want to show you another film by Donato Sansone, which is very interested not just in handmade drawings, but also in technologies, and this is an experiment that he shows most in galleries than in films, but which I think is interesting. And this was made all by After Effects, no 3D, because the question is that no 3D. And this is just to show you how the paintings and the technologies can go together, of course. The idea is the School of Urbino is handmade and blah, blah, blah. It's not that true. It depends. I think they all also will go further on with technology. It's just a matter of means and money, maybe. But I'm sure in contents as well, you have to see the retrospective of Magda Guidi. I hope it's not now, because she also evolves a lot in her style and in her film language and in her themes and subjects. There are films completely different one from another. With San Laszlo is very, very, very interesting approach to humor, to, how do you say, a punk idea, which is completely the opposite of what you expect from an Urbino daughter, you know, but it's not. I'm sure that it will be more, it will be flourishing. The important thing is, I think, not to create a divide between the commercial and the author. I mean, there is a divide, of course, but we all need money, and also we need more and more. For instance, in France, we see there are filmmakers who made short films, and now they are director of feature films. Why not? But we need to talk each other. And this is a little bit the philosophy of our school. Too often in Italy, the filmmakers, the authors, felt isolated too much, and being so isolated, they risk to be, how do you say, out of date sometimes, no? So the important thing, it is very important to go abroad, to show their films abroad, also because the School of Urbino had no means for distributing to festivals their films. Now they are doing a little more, no? Now there are, at least the graduating films are shown, but in the past it wasn't, so they really raised to be isolated, completely isolated, and that caused also like this common style, sometimes even too common, too shared, but I'm sure that they will develop a lot. And so the technology is important, and I have time for another 5 minutes? No, but I hope you will see the program of our school, in which there is this Cosmoetico film by Martina Scarpelli, which is, I think, another young author that can be included in this new wave, even though she uses digital drawing. She's not so keen, for her it's not that important to be handmade, is hand-drawn digitally, and also she approaches very personal themes in a very different way as well. So thank you very much for listening, and I think I would need another hour next year. Thank you.